I'm Clay Johnston. I'm a professor of neurology and epidemiology at the University of California, and I recently published a perspective in the New England Journal about patent foramen ovale and closure. A patent foramen ovale is a hole between the left and right atrium that can exist normally in 20 to 25% of the population, but has been associated with cryptogenic stroke. So there've certainly been described cases where people have seen clots passing through a patent foramen ovale and have recognized that some of those clots can go to the brain. So a clot that's developing as a deep venous thrombus can travel paradoxically from the right to the left atrium and then up to the brain and cause a stroke. Then, as people did more studies to look for the prevalence of PFO, they discovered that it was much more frequent in those with cryptogenic stroke or TIA than it was in the general population. So 45 to 50% in cryptogenic stroke patients and 20 to 25% in the general population, suggesting that it was related to cryptogenic stroke and potentially the cause of cryptogenic stroke in those patients. So the closure trial was a randomized trial that was sponsored by the company, by NMT, and it compared patients who arrived with cryptogenic stroke or TIA and compared PFO closure with their device to best medical therapy. And best medical therapy could be either anticoagulation or antiplatelet therapy. And followed the patients for 2 years. Primary outcome was a composite of stroke, TIA, and vascular death, complications from or death associated with the procedure itself. So they had a lot of trouble enrolling in the trial. Originally, they planned a larger trial, but they shrunk the sample size because they couldn't get the patients in. They included a lot of centers, but recruited at a rate of about 2 patients per site per year. So the trial took much longer to complete than they had thought it would. The primary problem was that patients who were considered good candidates for this were being treated open label and outside the trial. So it was hard to convince patients and clinicians to randomize into the trial when they had the option of being treated outside the trial open label. Yeah, so the procedure and device together cost roughly $10,000. So not an insignificant cost to society, to insurers, and some of that will get passed on to the patients. And in terms of the device itself, it's pretty safe, but about 3% of patients had some sort of major vascular complication. Often it was bleeding. And another 5% actually had new atrial fibrillation, usually transient after closure. And obviously atrial fibrillation is a known, established cause for stroke in patients, so something else that we would really want to avoid. So one of the problems with the trial is that if your best candidates for treatment are not being enrolled in the trial, and only sort of okay candidates for treatment are being enrolled, then you potentially are not representing the true underlying benefit of the device, and it's hard to know how much that occurred, but there is a possibility that patients who are at more high risk from their PFO as perceived by the clinicians were not being enrolled in the trial. So that's one major problem. And in terms of, well, should we based on that, just ignore these findings. And I would say no, we don't have any other randomized trial data that supports using this device. And so this is the only trial we have. And although it's not a perfect trial, it doesn't show any signal of efficacy. And there were safety concerns. So until we have better data, I think it's time to continue to enroll patients into trials, get the data on the trials that are now done, one trial that's completed enrollment, but stop doing these outside of trials. So there was another trial similar size to this one, actually doesn't include TIA in its outcome, which is a strength. Longer follow-up, took them even longer to finish their trial, but they've now just completed enrollment, and we expect results out from that. And it's a trial that's similar in design, but using the St. Jude's closure device. I think that the case had been made that this is a potential cause for stroke in those with no other identifiable causes, particularly the young, that a lot of clinicians believe that this is just the right thing to do. But in addition to that, this is a reimbursed procedure, and it's a pretty, straightforward one with low complications. And so I think that also drove use. It's a reimbursed procedure, and the reimbursement rates are decent for it. So with all that available off-label use of the device, it created quite a bit of competition for patients to be enrolled in the trial. Based on the evidence that we have today, limited to one trial, which was underpowered and not perfect, but that is the best evidence we have today. We don't have good evidence that we should be subjecting patients to this procedure and its associated costs. I think we've got probably 6 months to a year before we get results from a second trial. If that confirms this first trial, then I think we're done, at least for this general population, until someone does a new trial. So right now, I would just hold off and recommend that clinicians hold off in occluding PFOs until we have evidence that that's actually beneficial to patients. One of the problems with this whole area is that for half of the patients with a PFO and a cryptogenic stroke, the stroke had nothing to do with the PFO. And so given that, you have no chance to benefit half the patients with treatment. However, if the patient has a deep venous thrombosis, at the same time they're showing up with a cryptogenic stroke, then the likelihood that the PFO was the cause or contributed to the cause is much greater. It still doesn't mean that that should be closed, but at least that patient population is more likely to benefit. It'd be nice to have some more solid data to say that that kind of patient should be treated. We know the risk of recurrence for just the DVT is low, and so it may be that they're also at very low risk for having a recurrent stroke from the PFO. But at least there's a better, it's unresolved, I would say, in that population, and I think that would be the next target for a trial. Comment on it, but in terms of the big issue that you're raising about do we approve devices too early or too late, I think this is a crucial problem. I think if we require that every device have a randomized trial proving its utility before the device can be introduced, I think in some ways we'd benefit, and in some ways we would harm ourselves by slowing innovation. I think in this case, it's easy to imagine a better solution If we had not had off-label reimbursement for this device during this time, but instead the insurers covered the costs for patients entered into the trial, including all their treatment costs, but only covered if patients were entered into a trial, then this trial would have gotten done much more quickly. If the device worked, we would know much more quickly, and then the market for the device company would have been much, much greater. What happened here is they got to sell some of their devices along the way, and not an insignificant number, you know, close to 10,000 a year overall in the entire market. But that market remained small, and in this case doesn't appear to have been justified, at least for the subset of patients that look like those enrolled in this trial. So not a good outcome for them and not a good outcome for society. So I do think we need to think about better approaches to getting devices, getting proper data for devices sooner, but sharing costs with society, because we can't just continuously escalate costs for development for device companies.